I just cannot believe I was ever as young as you guys look to me today. It's just amazing. And I want to talk to you a little bit today about the Baptist Bible Fellowship and how it's become important to me over the years and why I think it ought to be important to you as well. And I'm going to start off with a little bit of autobiography. I really shouldn't even be here, really, when you stop and think about it. My family were default practical atheists. And it's not that they were philosophical atheists. We never talked about whether or not there was God existed or anything. God was simply just not relevant. There was no God in my home. We never prayed, never went to church or anything like that. And that's the way that I grew up. And so there was really no way in the world anything like this was ever going to happen to me. My father was a drunk. His dad was a drunk. Most of his brothers were drunks. Most of my cousins wound up a totally different kind of a life from the one that I had. There's a really big penitentiary in McAlester, Oklahoma, and I've often told people for our family to have a really, really good, honest family reunion, we'd all have to go to McAlester to do it, to get everybody included. That's the kind of background that I had. And I didn't come to church because I was drawn to church by the Spirit or by circumstances or anything. There was a girl involved, huh? Isn't there always? So when I was in my late teens, 16, 17 years old, I found out that the pastor's daughter at the local independent Baptist church looked pretty good. And I was invited by a friend to participate in some sort of a Halloween activity. So you're talking to a guy, you're looking at a guy basically who was saved as a result of a carnal desire in the middle of a Halloween activity. Okay, it should never have happened, and from a family of drunks and everything else. Then I once I was saved, I really sort of just imbibed the entire thing. I was a total vacuum and a sponge for all that kind of stuff. And so within just a couple of weeks, I had invited 2 or 3 of my friends to come to church with me, and the pastor's daughter found one of them much more exciting than me. And so that she was sort of in the dating ministry, I believe, really. And so, anyway, without her, people say, well, did you stay around? Well, sure, yeah. I mean, she was not the main attraction, obviously. And so I stayed around, and a few months later, we had a pastor change. She moved away and left my good friend in the dust. And then our new pastor began to talk to the kids in my group about giving their lives over to Jesus Christ completely. And so I surrendered after a few months to preach. And sort of messed around a lot, over the next couple of years, graduated high school, still didn't quite know what I was intending to do. One day, an Army recruiter got the better of me and argued me into joining the Army. And I went in and told my pastor that I had gone in, taken my physical, signed all the papers but one. They were going to put me on a bus about 3 days hence. And he said, "You're what?" I said, "I'm going to join the Army." And he says, "No, you're not." I said, "I'm not." He says, "No." I said, what am I doing?" He says, "You're going home, packing up, and you're going to go to Springfield, Missouri." "Oh, really?" "Yeah." So I went home, packed up, moved to Springfield, Missouri, enrolled at Baptist Bible College. I was a pastor's dream kid, let me tell you. I just did whatever he told me to do. And the rest is, as they say, sort of history. But except that I got here like in 1972, 73, something like that. And Baptist Bible College and Baptist Bible Fellowship were heading up toward their 25th anniversary. 25 years, and the fellowship had really grown and prospered, done really well. And there was an awful lot of kind of rah in the atmosphere, and especially that last year, 76. That was going to be the big 25th year, with the big graduation, the 25th graduating class of Baptist Bible College. And we were all supposed to be so excited about the 25 years. And they paraded the great heroes of the founding of the movement in front of us all the time and talked about this place called the Texas Hotel down in Fort Worth. And after a while, I just got sick of it. I said, I didn't have any background in the fellowship. I didn't have any grandmas or grandpas or anything involved in it. I had come in from basically the outside. I was just going to swoop in, take what I could out of this movement, and then get myself right back out again and figure out what God really wanted me to do and not hang around with all these organizational creeps, I just wasn't going to do that. That wasn't me. And so in 1976, I graduated, and just as soon as I could, I got out of here. And I said, I don't think I'm going to have anything to do with the Baptist Bible Fellowship. I don't want anything to do with Texas hotels and rah, and old dead heroes and those kinds of things. And look at me now. It's what I talk about all the time now. I lecture groups of people on the Baptist Bible Fellowship. How in the world did that happen? Well, I found out through just life experience of just how important that Baptist Bible Fellowship family can be to a guy, especially when you don't come to it from the inside, when you come to it from the outside, as I did. So let's talk about some questions this morning. Why is there a Baptist Bible Fellowship? What is a fellowship? What does it do? How do the participants work in it? And probably more important than anything else is there a biblical warrant? I think that was the biggest question I had in my mind. How does what we're doing, or at the time what they are doing as a fellowship, how does that fit in with what the Bible has to say? Is that something I really need to involve myself in? As we do this over today, and then we're going to come back again on Tuesday, for those of you who have not been completely lulled to sleep, or just looking for a little bit of extra nap time, come back on Tuesday and see if it works again. We'll come back and we'll talk about it some more. But here are some of the ideas that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about this biblical idea of koinonia, which is the Greek word for fellowship. We're going to talk about the rise of the 17th century Baptists in England and how that affects what we do today. We're going to talk about early Baptist organization in the United States. We're going to talk about the Southern Baptist Convention, because if we have forefathers in the independent movement, then we have four grandfathers in the Southern Baptist movement, because that's where a lot of those guys came from. And then we'll talk about some of the other independent movements in the 20th century and how we fit there. First of all, let's talk about Bible stuff here for a few minutes. The word fellowship in the New Testament is the most often used word to translate the Greek word koinonia. Those of you who have had a little bit of Greek or begun taking Greek, you come across the word koine, which is at the root of this word. It means common. It has to do with commonality. And it's actually found all over the New Testament. And it has not so much to do with just camaraderie and getting yourselves together and having a good time. Generally, the word talks about having things in common, having common resources, sharing resources with one another. Paul tells the Philippian church in his letter to them that he says, nobody communicated with me as you did concerning giving and receiving. That's the koinonia word. That's what he's talking about. Nobody fellowshiped with me quite the way you did. And when you look at the beginning of the Philippian letter, he says, I thank God for your fellowship. He's not just talking there about close friendship. He's talking about the fact you shared your resources with me. You sent me stuff when I needed stuff. And that sort of made us partners in the ministry. And we see examples then of how this koinonia thing works in several places, but there are two primary places I want to look at before we get too far along into Baptist history this morning. I'd like to think that what we do as Baptists has some sort of biblical basis, wouldn't you? Does that make you feel better about being a Baptist when you can say, oh, I see, what we do is what they did? Certainly it ought to make some sort of a difference to you. So let's talk about two things. First of all, we're going to talk about the offering that the apostle gathered up from the Gentile churches to take back to the Jewish people back in Jerusalem. And then we're going to talk about a council that took place in Acts chapter 15 and described in the book of Galatians then. First of all, let's talk about the offering. The Jewish people who were still being evangelized and were left behind in Jerusalem as the gospel mission sort of went out of Jerusalem and went out throughout the rest of the Roman Empire, were being heavily persecuted. They were under economic stress, And one of the things that the apostle wanted to do, Paul wanted to do, was he wanted, as a show both of good faith and love and concern for them, he wanted to show a solidarity with those brothers and sisters back in Jerusalem. Now, this offering is referenced several places in the New Testament. You can see the references there, 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9, Romans chapter 15, 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And in this offering idea, you're going to see here the beginning of a kind of a theme. It's going to be in this incident and also in the incident in Acts chapter 15. And that is the important place that unity had in the mind of the apostle. How many times do we read in the New Testament? The apostle Paul says, I want you all to be of the same mind. I want you to be unified. One Lord, one Spirit, one baptism. He talks an awful lot about oneness. Do you ever wonder why he does that? Why unity is such a big thing for him? Why he thinks that it's important that Christian people especially show that sort of solidarity. It's not just because that makes things go smoother. He's not a technician when it comes to management. Paul is a technician when it comes to theology. There's a theological basis for unity, he says. There's a good reason why whenever Christian people are together, they ought to be showing something significant in their interactions with one another. And here it is. Near, I forget exactly where it is in the Roman letter, but Paul tells the Romans, he says, pray that the saints in Jerusalem will receive this offering that has been taken up from the Gentile churches. Now, you also have to understand the word Gentile is a very, very kind of a clean, very, very kind of a good word. But in first century Palestine, the word would have been pagan or heathen. Whenever Paul talks about Gentiles, he's not talking about good people who happen to be of a different race. He's talking about those folks. And he says, the pagans. He says, we've taken up money from pagans and we're going to give it back to these saints here in Jerusalem. What he means is, of course, that he's been taking up offerings from these people that have been evangelized throughout the Roman Empire, and you can see him doing that in the book of Acts, gathering these things. But he tells the Romans, he says, I want you to pray that they will receive this offering. Now you think, now why would he have to pray that? Why would he ask them to pray that? Surely people are going to give you money. You're going to take the money, right? No. It's tainted money. It's tainted money in the minds of many of the Jews back in Jerusalem. Why? Because it's coming from the Gentiles. The thing that would get Paul riled up more than anything else that I'm able to see in the New Testament is anything that looks like there is a separation between Gentile saints and Jewish saints, no matter what the cause, whether it's a cultural cause, racial cause, ethnic cause, or a religious cause. And he views that to be very, very dangerous to the movement, as well as being very, very dangerous to the way the gospel is going to be perceived by the rest of the world. And so he tells these Romans, he says, pray that they will receive this offering. Because if they don't receive this offering, what does that teach you? What does that say? What is that showing the rest of the world? Well, I'll show you that in just a minute. You have another incident in the book of Galatians where Paul talks about this incident that he had in Antioch with Peter, who Peter, as a devout Jew all of his life, and then of course he comes to Christ and becomes a disciple and later on becomes a great leader in the movement, is perfectly willing, while nobody's looking, in Antioch to sit down with the new pagan Christians and have a meal with them and to have intercourse with them and have fellowship with them and interact with them. But then whenever people come down from Jerusalem, that he is wary of how are they going to think of me when they see me acting with these pagans here. And so it says that Peter withdrew himself from these other Gentiles. And he says, it's an amazing thing what Paul says. He says, even Barnabas was carried away with the hypocrisy of it. Even Barnabas, what a good man he was. And he said, Peter's actions were even affecting Barnabas. And so we have this great phrase that Paul uses, I withstood him to the face. How would we say that today? I got in his face. I got in his face. I'm a Christian brother. He's a Christian brother. I got in his face. You have to do that to Christian brothers every now and then when they're misbehaving. And so he got up in his face and he says, how is it, he says, that you as a forgiven sinner are perfectly at home with these other forgiven sinners until these people come down from Jerusalem? He says, that is wrong what you're doing, because when you can't have Jews and Gentiles sitting at the same table, what you are saying is what was said of the Ephesians in chapter 2 is still true in Paul's time and is still true today. What was it that he said in Ephesians chapter 2? He says, there was a time when you were without Christ, strangers from the commonwealth of Israel, without God and without hope in this world. But he said it was Jesus who brought you back together. And the blood of his sacrifice took two people and turned them into one person. One great people of God. And he said, Peter, when you separate yourself from these other Christian brothers for the sake of what others might think, he says, what you're doing is you're saying Jesus never came. You're saying Jesus never had any effect on the world. Everything is still exactly the same way that it was. We have two different peoples. They're not ever going to be connected. And he says that is a shame to the gospel. And so when Paul is talking about unity among brothers, he's not talking about a management technique. He's not talking about just good politics. He's talking about how the gospel is perceived by the rest of the world. When Christian people do not get along well with one another, we are making a gospel statement to the world saying basically we're like you. We're selfish. Nothing much has changed. Jesus coming into the world didn't do all that much. Jesus himself says as much in a couple of places, by the way. In the prayer in Gethsemane, Jesus prays to the Father and he says, make them one, so the world may know that the Father has indeed sent the Son. Unity is not a management technique. Unity is essential to the way the gospel is perceived. And that's the reason why Paul got up in his face. And that's the reason why he's praying now and telling the Romans to pray. Pray that the Jews in Jerusalem will receive the offering, even though it's tainted. And then, of course, this whole event shows us this interplay, this how churches are both dependent and also interdependent. By definition of koinonia, sharing resources, they are having a fellowship. And now we get to that Acts chapter 15 council, which I think is sort of based a little bit on that experience back there with Paul and Peter back in Antioch. In fact, it's primarily groups from two churches, Antioch and Jerusalem. They come together, but then later on, it affects more than just these two churches. They send out letters to the rest of the churches in the area and out throughout the Roman Empire saying these are some decisions that we have come to. And one of those decisions we came to was that Jews and Gentiles form one people of God. And while we are going to have this fellowship and we are going to have this unity, and we are also going to, for the sake of one another's not having offense, we're also going to have a form of an order, but at the same time we're going to try to balance our order with our independence at the same time, which is a very difficult thing. Is everybody in this crowd here adult? Okay? Mom and dad told you the facts of life? Or somebody did? Or you read it in a book somewhere, put it away real quick when somebody came around? You know what I'm talking about? Okay, now, think about it. You've seen animals. You've seen dogs. If you've been around animals at all, you know what they do when nobody's looking, right? Don't look at me like that. You know you do. Okay, you've seen this, okay? Now think about it for a minute. Everybody here know what a porcupine is? How do porcupines do that? For that matter, how do porcupines even survive any sort of close relationship whatsoever? A group of porcupines get into a den for the winter, a whole bunch of them. Think about 8, 9, 10 porcupines all gonna get down into a hole for the winter, you know. The snow's falling around, it's cold. Here's the trick. How do you get the maximum warmth from the porcupine next to you without getting stabbed? That's Baptist Bible Fellowship problems. Isn't it? Rick, you with me here? That's our problem. That's the problem Christians have everywhere. How do you get the maximum comfort and encouragement and exhortation and fellowship, koinonia, from the other people in the body of Christ without them jabbing you and you jabbing them? That's our problem. Acts chapter 15, they're facing up to that problem. Jews are saying, Gentiles, you got to follow the law of Moses. Gentiles saying, hey, we don't got to follow nobody's rules. Sound familiar? We've been dealing with this for an awfully long time. They finally came to a conclusion. They said, pagans, former pagans, Gentiles, look, don't do stuff that you know is just going to just make them crazy. And Jewish Christians, don't make these people be like you. They're not you. And they sent out letters, and they laid out just some sort of broad regulations. And they said it seemed good to the Holy Ghost and to us. God evidently is leading in this discussion. And the goal is, how do you maintain a form of order, minimize offense, and still allow room to see what would happen in this wonderful new dispensation where Jesus Christ is Lord? You see, they're really just sort of feeling their way around. They don't know much more about it than we do. But we have the benefit of their experience and what they have left us. Now, let's jump forward a little bit. I wish, and no doubt there are some people in our fellowship that believe that you can. I wish I could show that there was a direct link from what happened in Acts chapter 15 to another Baptist church about 30 years later, to another Baptist church about 40 years later, to another Baptist church. It's not there. What we know as Baptists today, ourselves, Southern Baptist Convention, all the other Baptist groups around the world, what we know, especially in this country, is that we can figure out kind of where we came from as far back as maybe the 17th century, perhaps even the 16th century. We do know that there were some ideas that had sort of come through the Dark Ages, medieval times, the Enlightenment age, and so on. But for the most part, if you want to find people that are a whole lot like us as Baptists, you really can't go much further back than that 17th, 16th century England. And so that's where we have to kind of go to try to figure out, what did they do? How did they take these Bible passages, and then how do they apply that to the way that they got themselves together and put themselves together in associations? What we do know is that they did form associations. They thought nothing of it. They said, look, it's koinonia, it's fellowship. Sometimes it would be a particular cause, a political reality. They composed confessions of faith to both identify themselves with the other Christian groups like the Presbyterians and the Anglicans, but they also wrote things in there that differentiated themselves as well. You look at a Baptist confession of faith and a Presbyterian confession of faith, you're going to find lots of overlap there until you get down to ecclesiology. And there you're going to find that the way we do church is different, the way we observe ordinances is different, and the same thing with some of the other Christian groups. And so they put together these confessions. You have London confessions, and then later on here in this country, confessions that come out of the northeastern part of the country. And these confessions are coming out of these groups of Baptists that are called associations. And so they didn't think anything at all about whether or not you ought to have an association. To them, it was just the most normal thing in the world. They did this so that they would be able to communicate with one another more effectively, so that they could cooperate together in their preaching and their church planting. A lot of the things that we do today, they did among themselves. In fact, we learned a lot of it from them. They also wanted a basic doctrinal uniformity. Now, they believed in autonomy of churches. I mean, otherwise they would not have been separatists to begin with. But they also believed that there were some basic doctrinal things that you just didn't mess around with. How many gods are there? Well, there's only one. You don't mess around with that. Who is Jesus? He is God's son. Is he God in the flesh, or is he a normal man with godly tendencies? No, he's God in the flesh. They all had to agree on these kinds of things. They agreed on many things like that. And they said, look, if you agree with us on these things here, then there's no reason why we can't get ourselves along and why we cannot associate with one another then. They also cooperated together in these associations for missionary activity. Not so much at first, though. An awful lot of the Baptists were very, very particularist. That was the word they used for the way that they viewed who could be saved and who could not be saved. Particularism. And there were some who believed that the gospel could go to anybody. There were some who believed, no, it has to be quite restricted. Eventually, those who were not so restricted wound up winning out a little bit better. They would consult with one another about difficulties that they had. They had to decide whether or not, well, here's an interesting thing that you may want to think about. Anybody here know anything about any sort of arguments going on today about music in churches? Have you heard anything like that? You know, I pastored for a little while when I first moved to Springfield area. I pastored a little church out in Cape Fair, which is about 35, 40 miles south of here, near Branson. Now, if you're near Branson in a church, you're going to have music that, well, it's going to be Branson music, isn't it? And I thought going out there, I probably wouldn't have to deal too much with those music kind of battles out there, but we did. Yeah, had to really put my foot down one day, and I said, look, I'm tired of all this fighting. We're going to have both kinds of music around here, country and Western, okay? And that solved the problem then. For a little while, then dress codes. Anybody here know anything about problems about dress codes and how you dress for churches? Man, I had a problem. Not with the women, though, it was the men. I had one group of men who believed you wore Big Smith overalls. Other ones believed you wore Oshkosh. It was a real mess. And then came the thing, do you carry your pouch of Red Man up here or back here? Nobody really knew, I had to straighten out a lot of problems in that church. But when you're straightening out problems like that, another church down the road may say, hey, we had that problem. How did you guys solve that? Well, churches associate with one another and they learn from one another like that. And here's another thing too. A lot of times these Baptists are under a lot of pressure politically. These associations help give them strength. A lot of what we do as Baptists in association with one another, a lot of times corresponds with the way that we also deal with politics in the secular realm. They sort of feed off of one another in a lot of ways. For instance, we vote a lot in Baptist churches. And that, of course, is also reflected. We believe one man, one vote. One person, one vote, excuse me. We believe in representative type of a government, and these are the sorts of things that go on in churches as well. And we get these sorts of things here from associations then. And then we move on from there. We see how a lot of this sort of transferred itself over to the United States during the colonization period. And as we go into the early 1800s, we get acquainted with great missionary leaders like Luther Rice and Adoniram Judson, who begin organizing primarily for missionary activity. This is kind of a new thing. It's not just association for association's sake, but it's the sharing of resources for particular purposes. And it becomes quite an exciting story from there on out. Now, in 1814, through the influence of Rice and Judson and some others, they put together for the first time a national organization called, I always have to read this, General Convention of the Baptist Denomination of the United States for Foreign Missions. That takes up a big part of the business card, whenever you pass those things out. But from 1814 till about the middle of the 19th century, Baptists were pretty much unified nationally. They met every 3 years. It was called the Triennial Convention, and it really was a convention. People would just come together every 3 years. They would see one another during the off times, but basically they would just sort of meet once every 3 years, and then in those 3 years they would raise money, they would give reports about the things that were happening, missionary societies, colleges starting, schools starting, orphanages, Bible publishers, book publishers, churches getting planted, and they would come together and they would report on these things and would rejoice with one another again in these organizations called associations. But however, by the mid-1800s, as you can well imagine, there began to be some political splits. Big one was slavery, of course. The northern churches tended to look down, of course, on the southerners who wanted to retain slavery, and felt like that this was not a Christian thing to do, and they felt like that they had to separate one from another. So sometimes you have to. Sometimes you have to do like what Paul said. You get up in a person's face. for the sake of a greater kind of a unity out there. And so that's what happened. And this led then to the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention, which, as I said a little while ago, sort of becomes the grandfather of the Baptist Bible Fellowship. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that and how the Southern Baptist Convention and some of their ideas came over into the movement that we're a part of today. We're going to have to